Text was written by Julian in the summer of 2023 and published by Eco-Revolt under the Creative Commons. Introduction. In between reading and commenting and correcting the first draft and receiving the second, Julian asked me for an introduction to the text that now holds your attention. On one of those days, my partner was doing some domestic chores and messaged me at work to ask if there was some task that she could do for me while she stored the energy and desire. How about writing the introduction to Julian's manifesto? The reply was immediate. If I have to read it, I'll need a glass or two of wine. I thought about that for a minute and sent her back this message. While in keeping with the absurdist foundation of the text, it actually doesn't matter if you read it or not. In fact, an introduction to it might be even better if you know nothing about the content. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how well you, the reader, feel about introductions and absurdist manifestos, I have read the text, and I feel like I'm in a decent position to provide a few comments and observations on it before you dive in. Aside from the oft-quoted premise, there are hints and echoes of, among others, Nietzsche and Stirner sprinkled throughout the text. Julian's project is not to create some grand synthesis of various European thinkers, however. This text is more like a product of philosophical foraging than academic rigor, and as a result is far more interesting and enjoyable. In these post-occupied days, when most anti-authoritarian social movements are under increased surveillance, attacks from by various arms of the state and erstwhile allies on the left, and continue to retreat, even while acknowledging moments of eruptive and often inspiring resistance. The lure of pessimism can often lead, as it has in the past in similar situations, to nihilism or outright abandonment. A certain amount of pessimism is probably endemic to social movements anyway, especially among the more clear-headed, but it doesn't usually lead to abandoning the struggle. Nihilism, though, even in the most positive forms of it, see the afterword for more on awkwardness and lack of clarity, often results in leaving the field of contestation. If the pessimist says, we probably won't win it, but let's try anyway, the nihilist might say, I definitely won't win, so why bother? Along comes Julian, eco-absurdist, to pivot around the entire conversation and declare, we're all going to die, so let's go for it. The pessimist doubts that they can have much effect on the larger social, political, and economic forces. The nihilist cares nothing for any particular outcome and may continue to pursue it regardless, but most likely won't. Julian shares with the pessimist the knowledge that saving badgers from culls won't end culling, but knows that it's still the right thing to do. He knows that the goal of ending badger culls is unattainable without the collapse of civilization, but persists nonetheless. He knows that all the badgers, Malays, as well as Julian himself, will die no matter what anyone does, but continue to help others to live. The eco-absurdist cares only that they are alive. Whether or not they are there might be a point to living in a discussion for another point, for another time. Introduction, or absurdity and revolt. Why would anyone write a book like this? Why would anyone read a book like this? Why have I put myself to the task of writing this book? Why have you chosen to read this book? Difference and the Munchausen trilemma render me suspicious of answers to why questions. Taken seriously, causality seemingly ends with cosmological beginnings and imaginary first causes, events no longer living individual experience, with uncaused causes, be they Big Bang, gods, or God. If there is no reason for actuality / being / the world / life, then I see no reason needed for this book to be or be read, or to not be or not be read. Yet I am alive. I have done what I have done, and I am doing what I am doing. I can attempt to justify my life and the choices I have made that are my freedom with absurd reasons, but I am somewhat disinclined towards the notion of needing to justify myself, as it inspires feelings of revolt. Why write? Why read? Why not? Why fucking not? Given my choice to write or not write, I'm motivated by passions, hungers, desires, wants, and sensations that make sense to my experience, my being, and my absurd individuality, which I doubt any other individual can understand fully. I can look at a friend eating a sandwich that looks revolting and unappetizing to me and wonder, why are they eating that? No doubt their absurd reasons would make sense to them, but to me they do not. My experience of the world is that it is an unreasonable place. Rather than from any book of philosophy, I learned pessimism, more through the death of my mother in my early childhood, my father's drug addiction, the abuses I experienced from family members and bullies at school, and the discovery in my late teens that I was born with a cancerous brain tumour, which was very nearly my death. I cannot make sense of the world, answer any question of why, nor find any reason for any of this. Famous states in the myth of Sisyphus that the strangest of the world is the absurd, to be without reason, but in absurdity and with absurd reasons, seems to me to exist in a confusing, unexplainable, and uncertain place. Chekhov states in All Things Are Possible that the business of philosophy is to teach humans to live in uncertainty, not to reassure us, but to upset us. Thinking about the philosophy that I am attempting to communicate here, I notice that this is about space, place, environment, world, or ecology, living in uncertainty as place, and the absurd as the strangest of the world as habitat are at the core of the philosophy that I am seeking to communicate here. I call this eco-absurdism. While there are many known popular optimistic philosophies, there are a few pessimistic philosophies, and fewer that are very popular. Buddhism perhaps being the most popular pessimist philosophy. The main schools of pessimist philosophy, which I will be dealing with here in this introductory piece, are existentialism, Buddhism, nihilism, and absurdism. These all have various subschools, and in all honesty, there are undoubtedly as many subschools as there are individuals who can be associated with the philosophies. So I will be generalizing, stereotyping, and will be limited in my descriptions in all the ways that I am limited. This is largely why writing about anything is somewhat absurd, but fuck it, I'm doing this. The pessimism that I see bringing these philosophies together begins with the affirmation of suffering. Life involves pain, discomfort, disappointment, anxiety, and unpleasant experience. Whatever you do, existence is not comfortable and is frequently unpleasant. Buddhism seeks to transcend this condition through non-attachment and belief in nirvana, while imposing a rational order to the world through the concept of karma, ultimately an effort to negate suffering, rendering Buddhism a form of negative hedonism. Without an innate logical structure into existence, the other three philosophies affirm, in varying intensities, an irrationality to life, existence, the world, being, and virtually all that we can talk about. Existentialism seeks to transcend this irrationality through the construction and creation of meaning and reasoning and through human-made orderings. As with Buddhism, this effort in transcending irrationality and suffering strikes me as an effort in negativity. Nihilism is a more honest pessimist philosophy than Buddhism and existentialism. It is openly negative and a practice of negation. Nihilism seeks to transcend irrationality and suffering, either through the negation of self via suicide, either as ending life or apathetic renunciation, or through the negativity of bombs and similar revolting violences. What distinguishes absurdism from these other pessimisms is that there is no attempt to transcend and negate suffering and irrationality, but an affirmation of the world as absurd and of the choice to live here. The effort to transcend the absurd world through negation and negativity is not simply limited to the pessimist philosophies, but is what civilization does. Forests perceive civilizations and deserts follow them. This is the negation of healthy habitat due to civilization seeking to transcend the wild and untameable ecological absurdity and environmental unreasonableness. Civilization slash Leviathan is a machinery of negation slash annihilation, manifest in the loss of habitat and biodiversity, the erasure of cultures that do not conform to civilization's design, and the assimilation slash annihilation of individuals who are deemed undesirable. What is not assimilated within the totality, what does not conform to the rationality of ideology, and what does not embrace the cause, is looked upon as not having a reason to live slash exist slash be. I am revolted by the negativity that I see in this culture. Disgusting, nauseating, horrific, grotesque. These are all somewhat appropriate terms to describe the feeling, but revolting perhaps fits best. Being revolted is not a moral state, but an aesthetic encounter. I positively affirm an experience of revolt that is somewhat visceral, somewhat in the heart, and somewhat in the head. I may also notice certain muscles tensing, my breath changing its rate and depth. Being revolted by what is revolting is an experience of affect. I then choose if I revolt or not. To revolt is an existential and political activity. To rebel in affirmation of life. Revolting is to be in revolt. The revolted in revolt are revolting. Bredipont in Species, Being and Other Stories asks, why don't people revolt against their conditions? As if individuals are not experiencing revolt, which is not something neither I nor they can know. Which is not. When I read this question, I feel something like boredom and disinterest. Any answer to the question would ultimately be absurd reasoning, and I do not have any interest in it. Games famously begins The Myth of Sisyphus by stating that the question of whether or not to commit suicide is the only real philosophical question. Camus was right, but backwards. I put the question as whether or not to embrace life. This question, with which we might begin this investigation of absurdist philosophy, is not a why question, and so does not sink into the potentially infinite abyss of causal reasoning and difference. Rather, it is, what are you doing? What are you going to do? What am I doing? And what am I going to do? Which are all far more interesting to me. The absurd answer is to embrace the life that is absurdity, and with a passion that is equally absurd. What am I doing? I am writing. I cannot say why I am writing. All reason is absurd to me, and I feel revolted by the notion of needing to justify my choice to do so. However, I can say something of my experience of how I got there. In saying how I got here, I am sharing the way I came to this place, where I am now, and the means by which I navigate the absurd world I find myself living within. I have come from revolting places into finding myself revolted, and now revolting. Writing this is an act of revolt for me. Most of the autobiographical elements of this experience make their way into the pieces within this collection, but I will share something here as well. In the months following the ending of my treatment for a pineal brain tumour, and a couple of years before the ecological shift in my attention and interest, there was a period in my life where I felt quite privately suicidal, and I was desiring transcendence. This flirtation with self-negation ended when I read Mrs. Smith's Sisyphus and some Nietzsche that I'd first read years before. The absurd life affirmation that has been at the core of my activities since this period very much stems from that moment. Writing this book is something of returning and reminding myself of/to this, which makes sense to me given the experiences I've had of late and the activities I have been engaged in. I have found myself revolted by much environmentalist, anarchist, and activist thought that I have encountered throughout my engagement with the discourse, particularly the pushes for transcendence and negation. This will come through intensely through the pieces within this collection. I am here amidst absurdity. I am revolted. I am revolting. I am in revolt. I revolt, therefore, the absurd is. Chapter 1. The banality of goodness and/or the banality of negation. The banality of evil, a term coined by Hannah Arendt, refers to how normal the terrible and terrifying was/is within the context of Leviathan. For Arendt, the Leviathan of post-World War II Western culture. Arendt coined the term as part of her description of observing Adolf Eichmann, who was a senior Nazi organizer of the Shoah. Rather than finding him to be a monster, she found him to be ordinary, which ultimately rendered the man more horrifying. The term could be applied to a great many terrible and terrifying machine narratives / industrial processes underway today. On multiple occasions, I've heard it used by anti-capitalists and leftists when recounting their experience of the horror they experience with the daily norms of Leviathan as it is now-ish. Were I inclined towards moral enframing, I could well describe the ordinariness of ecocide and specieside, the relentlessness of too fucking late capitalism and mass extinction machinery as falling within the concept of the banality of evil. I certainly find this normality terrible and terrifying, but I do not have any desire to proclaim a moralizing sermon about how evil all of this is, which would ultimately only serve as social performance, not really helping any living being and likely alienating those who do not consider themselves members of the cause. I have for many years, typically in face-to-face conversations, commented on the subject of goodness, that I have little desire to be good. I will then list examples such as Nazis, communists, Islamists, Christian colonialists, and missionaries, among others, as examples of people who in all likelihood thought themselves as the good guys and doing the good work, but who engage in acts that I find terribly ugly and revolting. I notice, more than anything, how goodness can motivate some of the most hideous of abuses, which I aesthetically find repellent. The criticism of this position, that my references are not of those actually doing good or thinking that they were doing good, rests on two connected bad faith assumptions, which I do not believe. That these individuals were either passive entities, caught up in narratives that they were unable to escape from, and/or that they knew that they were doing evil. I do not believe in villains who set out to do evil. Being socialized into morally dogmatic narratives renders most individuals inclined towards doing good. I am always suspicious and skeptical of claims of demonic figures who are out to do the bad things. Also, I do not believe in control, determinism, or causality. From an affirmation of freedom/wildness/ontological anarchy that is deeply uncomfortable to many, and myself on occasions, I do not believe that those engaged in hideous activities are entirely without choice, though of course, choices can be without desirable options, deeply uncomfortable, difficult, and humiliating. Not all acts of revolting goodness are as dramatic as the violent abuses of Marxist revolutionaries or repressive church agents. I have come to find myself increasingly revolted by the spectacle of inspirational advertising, ethical consumerist products, eco-industrialist narratives of green technological assimilation into the machinery that is mass extinction, and the systematic sanitization and recuperation of resistance via spectacles. This seemingly goes hand in hand with the progressivist, ameliorist political optimism that serves as a tonic to the doomscroll spectacle of the daily news media. Photos and videos of those suffering under war, alongside seemingly endless statistics regarding carbon emissions and global temperatures, soothed by the knowledge that the oat milk mocha was made with ethically sourced beans and poured into a cup made from recycled materials. State-approved protests that in no way disrupt daily productivity and industry enable individuals to occupy positions of having done the good work, because in more ways than not, they have, with goodness functioning as a cultural narrative that maintains normative abuse. I am largely in agreement with Zizek in his criticisms of ethical consumerism and notion that there is something desirably meaningful in the assimilation of anti-capitalism into productivity, though I have not yet encountered him critiquing this as fully and destructively as deconstructing, as I find this spectacle of goodness to warrant. Zizek's criticism falls short in that it ultimately ends with something akin to, it is not enough to take the bad and put the good into it. We must reconstruct society so that it is fully good without the bad. Which brings me back to the second paragraph of this piece. This amounts to an optimistic appeal for good industrialism, just simply without the badness that is capitalism. This ideological posturing, which is little more than common leftism, the colossally negative in that it requires an immense amount of annihilation to manufacture, good industrialism is left unchallenged. There is an ordinariness to the goodness of industrial annihilation and ethical consumerist spectacles, which I find horrifying, terrible, and revolting. The banality of good, of the negativity that the good work involves, is, within the spectacle today, arguably more dangerous than the banality of evil, though these are largely inseparable. The negativity of those actions that are approved of within the socio-cultural normative functioning are a different but still abusive form of negativity than those often classified as evil. I am left finding myself revolted by the entirety of what this supposed dialectical dualism of good and evil. I want no part in this totalitarian presence of negativity / negation / annihilation. I now find myself thrust into an awareness of the banality of negation and a feeling of deeply intense sorrow and sadness for how ordinary and normal the annihilation of living beings and wild habitats is within this too fucking late capitalist death camp. Culls, clear cuts, oceanic dead zones, factory farms, and industrial crop production. Examples of normal, everyday negations that come to mind. The annihilation of dissenters, rebels, and others who contradict the narratives of normal industrial productivity horrify me. Negativity in these senses strikes me as an actual cancel culture, and is far more revolting than liberal political correctness, though the negativity of individuals speaks to convert others into their lifestyle from a position of my way is the good way, revolts me too. How I respond to myself, how I respond to finding myself surrounded by techno-productive machinery and narratives of negation is by embracing a mad and absurd positivity as rebellion. This positivity is entirely different from what is often called toxic positivity, which I'd call happy-face negativity, in that this position involves affirming the sadness that inspires revolt and rebellion. From this, I became a weirdness amidst a normal negativity, which I thoroughly enjoy.